Hello and welcome to today's webinar. I'm your host, Brittany Satterfield. Today's session is provided to you by the International Knowledge Aware Association, which is a nonprofit organization built to assist organizations in transforming through knowledge-aware concepts. Today, we'll be discussing the legacy approaches for knowledge management, their failure modes, and how the knowledge-aware approach addresses these failures. Before we dive into the content, I'll go through some introductions. Again, I'm your host, Brittany Satterfield, the Board Secretary of the IKAA. With me today is one of the IKAA's founding members and President of Oral's Knowledge Systems, Jeff Maffa. Jeff has over 15 years of experience with the knowledge-aware approach and has been one of the primary contributors of the concept of knowledge-aware. It's great to have you back, Jeff.
Thanks, Brittany. Glad to be here.
So looking at the agenda for today's webinar, we'll start off by giving you a brief introduction to the knowledge-aware approach. Then, we'll walk you through the three legacy approaches for knowledge management, talk about their strengths and some of their failure modes. Then, we'll touch on what makes the knowledge-aware approach different. Following that, we'll open up to Q&A and share where you can find additional resources following today's session. Before we move on, I want to quickly point out that you don't have to wait until the end to ask your questions. Go ahead and type them in the chat box as they come up. And when it's time for Q&A, we'll answer them in the order they were received. All right, so let's get in it. Jeff, would you mind going through a brief introduction on the knowledge-aware approach?
Sure. To explain the approach most efficiently, we like to use a metaphor of paper maps. Now, Brittany, you may be too young to remember these things, but these were used to navigate in the olden days. Maps represented a good collection of knowledge that was correct on the date it was published, and it was all possible turns and roads in a given area of interest. But today we don't use maps because something far more powerful and more efficient in terms of transferring the knowledge of the map has come about. That is navigation. This is what we all use today. So why is this such a far superior model in navigation or in transferring knowledge of maps of a local area? The navigation app is providing to the driver just the right information at the right time. Knowledge Aware is going to do that for the end user. Think about it. The navigation app is sensing context, where you are, and it is provisioning in just the right map tiles as you travel. You change location, the right map tile for where you are shows up with just the roads that are in your immediate future. They also show you just the right turns as you need them, not all possible turns, which is very difficult to make use of while you're driving. And this information is always up to date, whereas the map is only up to date on the date it was published. But I submit to you that there's something far more powerful yet that's happening with navigation. The navigation app is collecting data from all other drivers, where they are, what routes they're taking, how fast they're traveling. And this kind of system of navigation is able to take that data and synthesize it into useful insights. Estimated time to arrival, for example. Traffic is another example. Now think about if we could do that in the real world with knowledge management, where we not only provision just the right knowledge as it's needed, the right turns, so to speak, but also collect data about how that knowledge is used, those turns are used, and provide insights back to the user. This becomes a very useful knowledge management schema. And to do this, we need to ready knowledge for reuse. And Knowledge Aware is all about this process of provisioning knowledge as it's needed and readying it for reuse and gathering data and providing insights to the user.
Yeah, I really like that analogy, Jeff. I'm sure it probably resonates with a lot of different people out there. So now that we kind of went through an introduction on the knowledge-aware approach, why don't you tell us about the three legacy approaches?
Sure, Brittany. There are three basic approaches that have been used in the past to capture and share knowledge. These three approaches are the document-centric approach, the people-centric approach, and the newer model-centric approach. So Brittany, are any of these approaches familiar to you?
Yeah, actually, at my previous job, I spent a lot of time in the document-centric approach. Specifically, we had a lot of different marketing files in our shared folders, OneDrive, SharePoint, and to be honest, it was a little bit messy, a lot of searching through, trying to find the right versions. Most of the time, we ended up just going to the person that knew the most about the subject matter expert and ask them the question. So it was pretty time consuming. I wouldn't say it was the best approach.
So I think I heard in what you just said, not only the document-based approach, but you approached experts. That's kind of the people-based approach. We'll get into that in a second. But importantly, your company was trying to capture knowledge and reuse it, which is good.
Okay, so let's get into the first approach, which is the document-centric approach. Now, before we talk more on the failure modes, Jeff, can you tell us what this approach is and what are some of the benefits behind this approach?
Sure. First off, the document-centric approach is clearly the most popular, and it has the most in common with paper maps. The idea is to capture knowledge onto documents, that provides some benefit. At least the knowledge is captured. So the document-centric approach generally involves experts writing down what they know and then storing those documents into some kind of electronic vault, SharePoint, and providing search engine capability over those documents. Again, it's probably the most common legacy approach for knowledge management. The benefits of the approach are that it's super easy for the author. It generally doesn't do much, as you described, for the end user trying to reuse knowledge, and we'll get to those failure modes in a second, but the inherent benefit is that it doesn't involve any kind of new technique. It's very easy for the author. It's an author-centric type process, and doesn't require any organizational change or new thought methods.
So those are great benefits, but what are some of the failure modes behind this approach?
Great, let's talk about those. So let's talk about the top 5 that are common to the document-centric approach. And I think most people will be familiar with these failure modes. First, knowledge is difficult to find or is uncaptured, right? So there's the problem of finding knowledge that is what I need. The document-based approach, even with the best search engine, has these failures. And certainly a search engine doesn't help you capture new knowledge. If the incentive model isn't in place to capture knowledge, it goes uncaptured. Brittany, you mentioned that when you got to your last position, you didn't have those processes or knowledge captured, and you did document them when you left. So you originally had the problem of uncaptured knowledge. Second, knowledge is not accurate or up to date. Given knowledge getting captured, document vaults inherently have this problem of having knowledge that's captured that is no longer true or not up to date or was never captured accurately, because documents themselves don't provide a great deal of capability in terms of managing that accurateness or managing that knowledge over time. Third, knowledge is hard to understand or not actionable. Now, Brittany, I'm sure you did a good job when you were leaving your job of creating knowledge that was understandable, but not everybody's equally as capable of documenting knowledge. And I think we've all done a search for knowledge in a document vault and found something that was difficult to understand, because experts aren't inherently good documenters. And without a tool set or an approach that addresses the understandability and actionability directly, you get a lot of noise in the knowledge base, and that noise then makes it hard to use. Next, knowledge is alternately verbose and incomplete. The way I like to describe this a little more succinctly is the granularity of knowledge is not controlled in a document. You've seen documents that you do a search for and you find it and you open it up and there's 300 pages, but you only need what's on page 93, paragraph 1. This is a difficult to reuse knowledge, and so why would you want to do this? And that makes the knowledge process far less effective. And lastly, as a roll-up of the first 4, you find that things aren't inaccurate, you find knowledge not captured, you find things not useful because it's alternately verbose or incomplete, and it's not, otherwise unusable. You start to not trust it. And when the user doesn't trust it, they don't use it. And if they don't use it when they learn something new, they don't add to it. And these things collectively form a cycle that causes knowledge to get reused, not to get used, not get captured, and we wind up having a system that is ineffective. Because capturing knowledge isn't what's important, reusing knowledge is what provides value for the overall technique. So if the user doesn't trust it, they're not going to use it. So just as a thought model here, if Google Navigate took you to the wrong building, the next time you want to navigate, are you going to use Google Maps?
Right, probably not.
Probably not. So systems that don't provide value, people don't use. And document vaults, unfortunately, are susceptible to this kind of behavior. And therefore, this is what it looks like to most people. Now, Brittany, when we share this slide with people interested in knowledge aware, they always tell us this is what it feels like to their end users with their document-based processes.
Yeah, I'm looking at this picture right now, smiling, because that's exactly how I felt at my last job. Hard to update documents and hard to find things, that's for sure.
Okay, can we talk about the people-centric approach?
Yeah, so that was a great walkthrough of the document-centric approach. So now we're going to move on to the people-centric approach. So why don't you tell us a little bit about this approach and what people like about it?
Right. So the people-centric approach is based on the idea that people can be connected with people. People who need knowledge can be connected with people who have knowledge. And it's a people-to-people process. So the great thing about this approach is that it's an extremely efficient process for knowledge transfer. So let me give you an example. Brittany, you're an expert in something and I have a need for that knowledge. I call you up. If you explain it to me in a way I don't understand, I can ask a question and you can clarify. This becomes a very efficient way of transferring knowledge. So, in the exact opposite of the document-based approach, where the document-based approach was very efficient for the expert, the people-based approach is very efficient for the reuser of knowledge, right? And so, for that reason, the people-centric approach can be quite useful.
Yeah, I can see those benefits are great, but what are some of the downfalls of this approach?
Sure. Just like the document-based approach, let's talk about the top 5 problems with the people-centric approach. And I think they're fairly obvious as well. First is the lack of velocity of reuse. It's limited and governed by the availability of the expert. Brittany, when you're on vacation, I can't call you, or at least you don't want me to call you, right? Yeah. So, and of course, if the person, if 2 reusers of knowledge need your expertise at the same time, that's not something you can really handle either, at least very well. So there's an inherent governing of velocity of knowledge when you're relying on people. A little less obvious, but still important, is the idea that point of view bias tends to happen when you focus in on people. Experts have the idea that they're experts, and they can develop points of view that may not be optimal for the enterprise. So when you rely on people, their influence generally will have some point of view bias, and that bias is difficult to segregate out when making decisions. Third, let's talk about transient decay. Brittany, I'm not sure what I had for breakfast yesterday. My point is that people learn stuff, and if it's not captured in anything other than gray matter, people can forget and will forget. You and I have the task of helping to create the Knowledge Aware Conference every year. And year over year, if we relied on our memory, we would do a poor task of redoing that conference. It's the capture of the knowledge in a more durable format that enables us to remember year from year, protect from transient decay of knowledge, and that's the reason why we use the Knowledge Aware technique on planning the Knowledge Aware Conference. And it's been quite useful for us, right?
Right. And you know, that's so important that what you're saying, isn't that why they make pilots use checklists before they take off for flights?
Exactly, Brittany, right? So even an expert, someone, a trained expert in flying a plane, the risks are so high that an error is too costly. And the pre-flight checklist or preoperative checklist for surgeons are very important ways of preventing transient decay from influencing or creating poor outcomes. Let's talk about the fourth one, leakage. So leakage is all about people leaving. And in today's age, this is a hugely important problem for personalization, people techniques for managing knowledge. So in oil and gas, for example, there's a graying of the industry where senior people are retiring. And an industry that had relied a lot on experts, now people are walking out the door. Of course, you can also have leakage where the expertise that you want in a person goes to your competitor. You've lost and your competitor's gained. That's a significant drawback of the personalization or the people-based approach. And lastly, not every expert is as willing to share or is capable of sharing. There's a social reticence that is based on the individuals involved. And a good knowledge management process shouldn't rely on these characteristics of experts. You want the best of knowledge management, not based on their willingness to share or to work with other people.
All right, so that's very interesting, Jeff. All right, so moving on to our model-centric approach. This one I'm not as familiar with. Can you tell us a little bit about this approach and what people like about this?
Sure. So I think most people will be less familiar with the model-centric approach, but it's an important technique and one that seems to be emerging more and more every day. The model-centric approach is all about creating models that disseminate knowledge. So for you engineers out there, we have models in CAD, computer-aided design, and these models can be encoded with rules of design that distribute knowledge to the end user quite efficiently. In engineering knowledge being disseminated through the model itself. But it's not just CAD models, it could be any kind of model, process models, financial models, and when the logic or the knowledge is encoded in those models, it is efficiently disseminated to many end users. So it overcomes the problems of an expert in that there's high velocity. Anybody who accesses the model can access the knowledge. It overcomes a lot of the problems of documents because now it's actionable. It's very easy to reuse from the end user standpoint. It's in the flow of work because the flow of work goes through these models. So it has a lot of advantages over the previous two approaches that we talked about.
Yeah, it sounds like it has quite a few benefits. So can you tell us a little bit about these downfalls, these failure modes?
Sure. Let's take the top 5 again. So the first is it requires the model. So the model is an expense. It takes time and complexity to create. And so the first problem is that you've got to create models to do this approach. But the potential value is huge, so people do this. The next failure mode is that it requires non-domain expertise. So Brittany, you have expertise in your domain, but you probably don't have expertise in the domain that creates models. And so that is an inherent problem and barrier to creating and using the approach. Third, it's difficult to maintain and update knowledge in the context of a model. There's another level of complexity. And updating and maintaining knowledge can lead to problems if not done properly. And then you've got the problem that models generally are aggregating different experts' knowledge, and there's one place to do the updation, but multiple experts, and that inherently is a problem. Those are all big problems, but I submit these last two are the most important. When you have a model and you're encoding the knowledge in the model for this efficient distribution, it's likely that you also then have to duplicate that knowledge in clear text somewhere else. So that means there's two versions of this knowledge, the clear text version and the encoded knowledge in the model. And if you're familiar with the knowledge-aware approach already, you know that that breaks one of the core tenets that knowledge has a gold source and it's reused wherever it needs to be reused from its gold source. So the duplication means there's synchronizing problems, updating problems, and that's a significant problem of just relying on the model-centric approach without adding the knowledge-aware approach into it. And lastly, the model-based approach by itself inherently is ancillary, meaning not all knowledge is relatable to models, which means we need a second place or a primary place to store knowledge, and the model-based approach becomes secondary or ancillary. And now we've got, it's corollary to the duplication, but instead of duplication where we got the knowledge existing in two spots, now we've got a place that we need to put knowledge that doesn't fit into a model, and so we have to have a second repository. And that is also against the knowledge-aware principles where there's a single process and method for capturing knowledge and it's distributed to wherever and whenever it's needed. So these are the failure modes of the model-based approach.
So I can see how some of those failure modes can cause big problems for organizations down the road. So what we really need is something with the best of both worlds from all three approaches, don't we, Jeff?
Exactly, Brittany. And we call that the knowledge-aware approach. So if you recall, knowledge-aware approach is about provisioning knowledge just as it's needed and ready for reuse in the same way that turn directions and map tiles are provisioned to a navigation app readied for reuse. So we can learn a lot from these three models. The document-centric approach really looks and is good at crowdsourcing knowledge, versioning knowledge, and engaging authors, right? And so the knowledge-aware approach captures those benefits while avoiding the failure modes. The people-centric approach is really important as well as how it engages end users and how it enables the end users of knowledge to get and react and connect with the authors of knowledge. It's this idea of crowdsourcing. And the knowledge-aware approach engages experts in a way that is similar to the people-centric approach, but puts between the expert and the reuser of knowledge a reusable representation of knowledge. And lastly, the model-centric approach gives knowledge actionability and gives us the ability to capture data about how knowledge is getting reused. And that knowledge-aware approach does those things very well and mimics the ability of provisioning knowledge as it's needed.
So I have a question for you, Jeff. How does the knowledge-aware approach keep knowledge up to date, and how do you know that it will be reused?
What the knowledge-aware process does is it creates a closed-loop process where people who reuse knowledge get the benefit of knowledge. A system they trust, they get benefit, and they understand how knowledge that's been captured will get reused. They have an understanding of that without thinking about it, which will cause them, as they learn new things, to want to contribute in this method so that it can be reused. And as their knowledge then gets into the process, so to speak, it will create additionally higher levels of reuse for others, and so on and so on. And you get a process that continually creates knowledge. And we see this without question at the existing practitioners of the knowledge-aware process. Think of it this way. Every day you come in and read email and write email. And you do this because you know you have the expectation that others will read your email and respond. In the document world, if you were just asked to capture your knowledge without the trust that someone will reuse it and understanding of how it's going to get reused, you don't necessarily want to contribute on that document. But in this knowledge-aware process, you can see it. It can be measured. You benefit. You're far more likely to use that process to capture the knowledge that you learned. And you can benefit from that. And the process begets success, and success begets success, and so on. And we see this at practitioners of the knowledge-aware process, where the creation and maintenance of the knowledge base is the effort is a non-issue, because people choose to communicate this way in the same way they choose to communicate through email. Only in this case, what we achieve is a improving and refining knowledge base over time.
Okay, that's some great stuff you shared there, Jeff. So before we start to answer some questions, why don't you give us a quick recap of what you just shared?
Sure. So what we talked about is that the knowledge-aware process is similar to navigation in replacing paper maps. We're replacing documents and the people-based processes with a process that captures knowledge, readies it for reuse, and provision it into people's workflows as they need it. Then we looked at the traditional, maybe simplified methods of knowledge management. Those are the document-centric approach, the people-centric approach, and the emerging model-centric approach. And we understand that most companies that emphasize knowledge management probably use a blend of those three, not any one particular. And they've addressed some of the failure modes. But the conclusion to be made is that there is a comprehensive strategy that can best pull the best elements from those three methods and provide a unified strategy for managing knowledge. And that approach is called the knowledge-aware approach.
All right, thanks, Jeff. So at this time, if you have any questions, please type your questions in the chat box now. For now, I'm going to start reading off the questions that were sent in earlier. All right, the first question is, you mentioned biased opinion in the people-centric approach. How does the knowledge-aware approach remove the biased opinion from the knowledge management process?
Most excellent and insightful question. And I believe one that could be an entire webinar in and of itself. But the knowledge-aware approach does directly help to remove biases from the process. And the way it does this is by either detecting the bias or by otherwise visualizing the bias. So let's go back to our metaphor to give an example of how this works. Let's say the expert says you should turn right, and driver goes by that turn and goes straight. The next driver goes by that turn and goes straight. So as the system collects this data, it indicates that there's something wrong with the expert's opinion to turn right. So this may or may not be biased, but it is an indication that it needs to be looked at, and when it is looked at, the biases can be revealed and adjusted. Okay, that's one way. Let's talk about visualization of biases. So we talked about one tenet of the knowledge-aware approach previously, that there should only be a gold source for the knowledge, and it's reused in its gold source everywhere. There's another tenet that says that individual points of view should be persisted. So when you talk to an expert, you're getting one point of view, and it's very difficult to know whether there's bias. However, in a high velocity system, velocity of knowledge flow, like knowledge-aware provides, you will get a variety of these expert views, which may contain biases, but as you get multiple points of view, the biases show up in the differences of opinion. So where you have only one opinion, you cannot see bias. But where you have multiple points of view, the biases reveal themselves. And in the knowledge-aware approach, where you have these multiple points of views persisted as a tenet of the process, the biases emerge. So there's just two ways. I think there's probably many others in the knowledge-aware process that reveal biases and remove biases, but those are the two examples we can look at pretty easily.
All right, second question. So the model-based approach sounds very powerful, but at one point, is it justifiable?
A modeler probably, a modeler like myself. Okay, so I don't have any direct answers. I can say, and I think it's fairly obvious for those of you who are intimate with the model-based world, that the cost of modeling is going down. So the first thing I'll say to answer that question is it's a moving target. Modeling as a science is becoming cheaper. The expertise is more readily available, and the energies required to produce models is dropping. But that still doesn't get around several of the model-based failures, the duplication of the knowledge, or the single source, or single repository for knowledge. So the answer really is to use a knowledge-aware technique to abstract a knowledge, ready it for use, and provision it to the model in real time. And that's really what the knowledge-aware technique has to say about the modeling. So while I can't answer the question about where modeling starts to make sense from an expense standpoint or from an energy standpoint, I can say that it's a moving target and the target is dropping.
All right, so we are getting close to the 30-minute mark, so I will read off one more question for you, Jeff, and which is, I like the concept of the virtuous cycle, but how does it get started?
That's a tough one. You left me with a tough one for the final question. I don't know that it has a starting point. Like any cycle, each element connected is what's required to get going. So instead of thinking of it as having a starting point, it's best to think of it as having a critical mass. So the way this works is there are elements of the cycle. You have success, so you contribute. The contribution then is readily available to others. Others make use of it and have successes, which then beget success. So these are the connected points of the virtuous cycle. So there will start, but there is a critical mass, an amount of energy where after that point, the energy created is more than it consumes, more than the energy is applied. When I talk to prospective customers or prospective knowledge-aware practitioners, I suggest this is the point where you can take your foot off the gas. That's how I explain it. So it's true, at the beginning, to get the cycle going, there needs to be some effort applied to connect these dots and to get the cycle going. But what we've seen time and time again is that there's a certain critical mass where you take the foot off the gas and people will start using it. I mentioned email before, right? There were times when people had to be encouraged to use email. I mean, it's hard to imagine, but I had an area manager who didn't read his email. Some of you have probably heard me talk about that story in the past. But as the connected process started to take hold and the number of people participating was sufficient, you know what? Email was a no-brainer and people just did it. And so that's the same thing here. So starting point maybe not as important as critical mass, and you just know when that happens.
So I do want to make sure there's enough time to go through the last few slides, so I'm going to close out the Q&A at this time. For those who didn't hear the responses to their questions, we'll reach out to you individually following the session today. One of the things I wanted to mention before you left was the upcoming Knowledge Aware Conference. It's a great 2-day event if you're thinking about expanding your understanding of the Knowledge Aware approach. If you're interested in attending, visit IKAAconference.org to register. And if you're interested in learning more about the Knowledge Aware approach, the International Knowledge Aware Association is a great resource to also take advantage of. Now until June 1st, you can register as a member for free. One of the greatest benefits of becoming a member is getting full access to the annual Knowledge Aware conferences and the resources offered by the IKAA. If you're interested in joining as a member, just visit knowledge-aware.org to apply. So that's it for today. We hope you're able to learn something new in today's webinar. If you don't mind, please take a minute to complete the survey that pops up after the webinar today. We would truly appreciate it. Thanks for coming, and we hope to see you at the Knowledge Aware Conference this September. Bye.